Is it better than Putin bargained for? Critics of Geneva talks between Cold War rivals say they reward the Kremlin for its massive troop buildup on the Ukrainian border. Would the United States be sitting down with Russia without the threat of an invasion? Is it better to talk or not to talk? Now, this is about much more than just Ukraine. Back in November, Vladimir Putin called U.S.-led NATO naval maneuvers in the Black Sea a, quote, serious challenge. In other words, a direct threat. And there are calls to revive lapsed Cold War-era treaties that keep a lid on nuclear warheads in Europe. Which this time again left out of the talks about the escalation on its border. We can show you images of the EU's foreign policy chief last week near the front line in eastern Ukraine. Josep Borrell showing his support for Kiev there. Some on this continent fear Geneva could lead to another Yalta, a nod to that summit that drew the map of Cold War Europe. A redrawing of the map without the Europeans. We'll see if that's an exaggeration. Putting it to our panel today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the summit in Geneva. We'll be joined from Moscow by Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. With us from Washington, Molly McHugh, lead writer at greatpower.us. Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we do have Andrei Kortunov with us, who's just joined us. The tech gods could not doing a good job on that one. Andrei, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From Warsaw, Wojciech Lorenz, senior analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, will be with us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. Yeah, positive noises we heard at the end of that round from two seasoned diplomats. You had Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov leading the discussions alongside U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, and no points for guessing the elephant in the room.
It's not an equalizer for our intention to invade, to attack, to do whatever with respect to Ukraine. We are worried, though, and concerned on possible provocations on the part of Ukraine, deliberate provocations that may create a situation where probability for some clashes will grow. We need to avoid this.
Andrei Kortunov, further, there was this statement by the Deputy Foreign Minister saying that if the demands, if its ultimatums are not met, that there would be a, quote, technical military response. Should we be alarmed by that?
Well, I think that probably the United States and its European allies should be alarmed, because that would mean an uncontrolled arms race in Europe and new Russian missiles close to a number of European partners of the United States. The risks of an inadvertent escalation and the costs of this confrontation are likely to grow. However, I do believe that there is a way to somehow bring more order into this adversarial relationship and to reduce the costs and the risks. I think it is still possible, though it is not easy to achieve.
All right, so there's still a possibility to reduce the risk of an escalation, be it purposeful or inadvertent. Do you agree, Molly McHugh?
I think everybody hopes there's the chance to avert escalation. The problem is what factors we're looking at in that. And I think the problem with these talks, of course, is it's rewarding Russian escalation. And every time we have these talks, after Russia escalates, after they levy unwarranted threats against Ukraine, accuse them of potential provocations when they have the entire Russian army piled on the border, I mean, it's rewarding bad behavior from Moscow. And I think everybody knows that this is an unsustainable cycle of escalation and aggression from Russia. And I think there's much more serious thinking on the other side now about how to end this cycle.
So are you suggesting, Molly, are you suggesting
greater defense to Ukraine?
Are you suggesting that these talks in Geneva were a bad idea?
I think the talks were inevitable, but I think we went into them on the wrong footing. And I think a lot of people, and by that I mean within the alliance, I think there was a lot of disgruntlement about these talks, how they happened, how they came about, who was involved. And the fact that it created more disunity in the alliance and right now more uncertainty about where we are going into this week is bad for us.
More uncertainty? Let me bring in Wojciech Lorenz from Warsaw, senior analyst at the Polish Institute for International Affairs. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Molly McHugh pointing to the fact that on Wednesday there's going to be more talks between Russia and NATO, and then on Thursday with members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. She's saying that it's perhaps bringing more uncertainty, the fact that we had these talks in Geneva today. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that it's quite well organized now, that the West tried to strengthen its political cohesion through consultations ahead of those talks. And this is not by accident that we had this extraordinary meeting of NATO foreign ministers on Friday, when they sent a clear signal that there will be no compromise on the values, on the principles that European or transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic security system is based on, that not only all European states, but also Russia as a major European power subscribed to those principles. One of those principles is the freedom of sovereign states to choose their alliances. So there was a very strong signal that there will be no acceptance for Russian sphere of influence and Russia's buffer zone extending to NATO and EU territory, which actually Russia demanded in those two treaty proposals that it put on the table in mid-December. So, of course, historically speaking, when we look at those fears of European allies that the United States will talk with Russia over their heads, this worry is always there, especially it is very acute in the small and mid-sized countries. But at the same time, we now see that it is much better organized than months ago, that we have consultations, that U.S. State Department talks to the allies, that NATO tries to strengthen its political cohesion. NATO talks to Ukraine, consults with Ukraine. So we go into this dialogue with Russia. We try to de-escalate because NATO is not the aggressive alliance. This is defensive alliance. It wants to defend its allies, and it goes into those talks with Russia with clear mind what is Russia's goal and where we can look for some compromise. It is definitely in arms control, in transparency, but I don't think that that any state, not only international organizations like NATO or EU, would accept the concept of sphere of influence, but that there are no single state in those organizations that would approve of anything like this.
Andrei Kortunov, when Russia says that it's a red line, Ukraine or Georgia ever joining NATO, when it talks about, as you just heard Wojciech say, spheres of influence, is that really a red line, or is it a bargaining posture for all the other issues we're about to discuss?
Well, frankly, I don't know. But I think that the reality is that neither Ukraine nor Georgia is likely to join NATO anytime soon. It will not happen next year. It will not happen 5 years from now. Probably it will not happen even in 10 years from now. So the question is whether the Kremlin can be satisfied with a de facto moratorium on the NATO enlargement to the east, or it would really insist on legally binding commitments by the NATO alliance. In this latter case, I think it's a non-starter. I don't think that NATO can grant such assurances to the Kremlin. But if NATO demonstrates certain restraint in its cooperation with the leadership in Kiev, and this restraint would disincentivize the Ukrainian leadership to consider a military solution to the Donbas problem, that might constitute a basis for a compromise. Again, it's hard to tell whether this is something that can be accepted by the NATO alliance. But if we look at the negotiations that took place today, I think that the United States very appropriately delegated the most sensitive and the most painful issues to the discussions within the NATO-Russia Council framework, and the United States limited itself to discussing issues which belong to the bilateral agenda of the U.S.-Russian relations.
Yeah, it's not all about Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine may even seem like the bait for what really riles Russia.
That's right. I think that this is the stumbling block, and for the Russian leadership, it is a kind of existential challenge that it has to cope with. I think it will take some time before the Kremlin accepts Ukraine as a fully independent country, which has its own right to choose the trajectory of its development. And let me also add that though, of course, there is a very clear statement in the Paris Charter that every country can choose its military alliances or political allegiances. It is also stated there that no country should make any steps that would jeopardize security of other European nations. And this is exactly the point which the Russian leadership is making an emphasis on. So here we see really a contradiction between two very important principles of the European collective security system.
And as we saw in that map we just displayed, Ukraine now surrounded on three sides by Russian forces, what with Crimea having been annexed in 2014, 100,000 troops and all. And yet, again, we heard it from the foreign ministry in Moscow. We'll listen to their spokesperson, that it's not all about Ukraine.
That's absolutely right.
During the talks, we will see firm legal guarantees of Russia's security from the U.S. side, namely that NATO will not move eastwards and that weapon systems threatening Russia will not be deployed near our borders.
Molly McHugh, there was a sense listening to the wording of the U.S. and the Russian team coming out of Geneva that they did break the ice on these important matters. The weapon systems that Maria Zakharova refers to there are real. We're talking about the missile defense shield system set up under George W. Bush. It's got we could show another map. It's got an early warning system in Turkey, a command center at the U.S. base in Ramstein, Germany, and two launch pads for the so-called Aegis Ashore system, one in southern Romania. We can show it on this map here. The other coming online in northern Poland, right next to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. On that point, there's a need to go back to some kind of a treaty right now to limit missiles and for both sides to feel safer?
Sure. I think if you overlay that map with, of course, Russia's famous A2AD map, their missile defense systems that cover the entirety of Europe and the Mediterranean now, you'll understand why NATO is putting more missile systems into Europe. And I think that this is the constant challenge we get into is Russia says, we feel unsafe. They pile weapons and point them at us, and then they say it's our fault. And this is where we are right now. And I think hopefully the talks did break the ice. I think we're already in a back-footed position, we, the West, because Russia forced these talks with escalation. The talks are not about Ukraine, despite the escalation against Ukraine. They are about European security architecture, which is a major win for the Kremlin. And we were not organized going into this week. I think our Polish colleague is correct that there's been a lot of last-minute sort of sticking together of all the things. and it's better than it was, but this isn't happening the way that it should, and it is very much forced and coercive, and that's never a good way for these things to happen. I think the stance of NATO and Europe has not been one of aggression, and it's very clear what Russia has been doing to its neighbors in recent years, and I think that we need to be very clear about what that is and not miscalculate how we are negotiating across the table.
Wojciech Lorenz?
Well, with the missile defense system, this is a great stunt from Russia because it's been pretty obvious that United States invested and then NATO agreed to develop this system to exert pressure on Iran to demonstrate to Iran that Iran will not achieve its goals.
Really, even when there's a weapon system in northern Poland right next to Kaliningrad?
Exactly. Yes, there are.
It's about Iran.
This is about Iran and the Iran missiles that are able to hit U.S. installations in Europe, and this architecture is well described in many reports. So we have no time to discuss this in details, but this is easily available everywhere. But from the Russian perspective, of course, Russia sent a warning early in the 90s that if Russia's security interests are not taken under account, Russia will try to strengthen its relations with Iran, with China, and it will try to limit the West's room of maneuver. And this is why, first of all, Russia is unhappy about the system because it decreases Russia's ability to become a spoiler, and it also enrages Russia because of U.S. installations in the region, because the U.S. strategic interests appear in this region. So if Russia wants to reclaim back the sphere of influence, to increase its control over the neighborhood, so with the U.S. strategic assets here in the region, it becomes more difficult. So obviously, for Russia, it would be a great success if the United States decided to get rid of this system. I don't think that this is on the table. You will also see that this is just like Russian propaganda. There are only 24 launchers. Russia has 1,500 strategic nuclear warheads, so 24 launchers in Poland and a similar number in Romania. It does not undermine in any way Russia's strategic deterrent.
But both sides can agree, Wojciech, on going back to some kind of limitation of the number of ballistic missiles on the continent?
Well, there are ballistic missiles on the continent, but Russia has ballistic missiles, and Russia violated INF Treaty. It developed the missiles which were forbade by the treaty with the range above 550 kilometers, and similarly to what it did in 1970s and 1980s when it deployed SS-20 intermediate missiles. After it started to deploy those missiles, it offered to the West, to NATO, a moratorium on the deployment of similar systems. So first it deployed the system, and then it proposed, to freeze the deployment. So it tried to augment its superiority over NATO, and it does exactly the same thing today. It develops the weapons that threaten the whole European territory, and then it comes with the proposal, okay, let's talk about freezing the deployment of those systems, and let's have the legally binding assurances that United States and NATO will not deploy such systems in Europe. So this is Russia's game. It just wants to augment its military superiority in certain areas, but there are just significantly important areas that can influence the threat perception of NATO states and can divide NATO politically. So this is why there should be no concessions. There should be negotiations on arms control, but it needs to be based on reciprocity. So if NATO and United States imposes any limitations on its deployments, Russia should also move away its weapons, I don't know, behind the Urals.
So Andrei Kortunov, if I list the three big issues we've talked about, Ukraine, obviously, missile defense shields, and the limitation in the number of nuclear missiles pointed in both directions, which is highest on the list for Moscow?
Well, I think that if you take the immediate concerns of the Kremlin, they are clearly concerned about Ukraine trying to have a small victorious war in the east. And they are concerned about Ukraine deviating even further from the letter and the spirit of the Minsk agreements. So I think that the immediate concern is to prevent Ukraine trying to use military force in recapturing Donbass. In terms of the mid-range strategic missiles in Europe, I think this is an issue that can be negotiated between Russia and the United States, and I think that a compromise here is quite possible. I don't think that Russia will not get to some kind of consensus on these types of weapons. But in the end of the day, the problem remains how to turn Russia into a stakeholder into the new European security architecture, because the choice for Russia is very clear. Either it becomes a stakeholder or it becomes a spoiler. And how to get Russia a place in the European security system, a place at the table without giving Russia veto power. This is something that we wrestled for the last 30 years, but we couldn't find an appropriate solution for this problem, and the problem is still there.
How do you do it, Molly McHugh? I know in the early 90s, there was a U.S. Secretary of State who even thought that it would be a good idea to have Russia join NATO. Of course, that ship has long sailed. But how do you make Russia a stakeholder, not a spoiler?
There are plenty of frameworks in which Russia has a seat at the table to be a part of discussions about European security. It has squandered the opportunities to have those seats by invading Georgia, invading Ukraine again, and a number of other measures that it's taken to interfere in the decision-making of its neighboring states that it has decided are still part of its sphere of influence. So I think this discussion, which of these things is most important for Russia? None of them. Screwing up European security architecture and limiting the effectiveness of NATO and creating divides in the transatlantic alliance are what Russia is focused on. It's not these other things that it says are the most important things. And I think that if we look at that strategically, they are making significant gains, and we all need to remain focused on that.
What's interesting,
it is not our fault that Russia feels alienated from the continent.
Right. And what's interesting, if I splice together what you've just said about a European security architecture and what Andrei said previously about how there can be a negotiation between the U.S. and Russia on that matter, of course, it leaves out one party, which is the Europeans themselves, just as the Europeans were not present at the table in Geneva this Monday. But the Europeans divided over whether to engage Putin. Paris and Berlin are for, and have been doing so. Last Friday, when he welcomed the European Commission, President Emmanuel Macron, whose country holds the rotating presidency of the EU, said it was, quote, good that there are discussions between Russia and the United States.
I had long telephone conversations with President Putin these past 2 weeks, and I'll have further conversations in the coming days. The EU must talk with Russia. Dialogue doesn't mean conceding, it means to review our disagreements, but also to try to secure the future.
Faire le point sur nos désaccords, mais essayer de construire l'avenir.
So, Molly McHugh, 2 points. You have Emmanuel Macron saying, let's talk to Russia, but also talking more about strategic autonomy. In other words, if I translate this, less reliance on the United States for Europe's own defense. Your thoughts on where those points are going now?
I mean, look, I think the United States has been pretty excited about Europe participating more in its potential defense for a long time. And I think some of the smaller NATO allies have been very forward-leaning in taking on that role when others should be more forthcoming. But I think the tensions that we feel about European sovereignty, European autonomy, vis-a-vis the role of the U.S. and NATO, it has to do with this conflict within Europe about its economic desires versus its security needs, which are very much out of alignment right now. And that's not to say that the rest of us don't have challenges to confront, but the desire to take the Russian money, which is corrupting the ability to have clear-eyed national defense plans, is something that France and Germany really need to take a close look at. And it's a challenge inside the NATO alliance, which should remain the primary negotiating seat against Russia right now, for the very reason that it was created, which is it gives a cohesive whole to the strongest possible alliance of democracy and prosperity and security against a revanchist, aggressive opponent.
Wojciech Lorenz, Europe will be present at the table, but only on Thursday, when there's those OSCE discussions with Russia. First of all, do you agree with Emmanuel Macron when he says, look, we talk directly to Moscow, you have to talk with your adversaries?
Yes, I think that, for democratic states, it is very important that you maintain dialogue. And it is also official NATO policy that we strengthen defense and deterrence, but it is complemented with dialogue with Russia. So there are different formats, NATO-Russia Council. There can be like EU-Russia summits, and we have OSCE, and of course bilateral formats. But it is absolutely fundamental in the situation like this that we consult before the negotiations and that we maintain a common stance, that we defend.
Do you have the feeling that the EU has been sidelined?
No, not really. I think that at this very moment, it is quite important what you said about the European strategic autonomy, that we understand what we mean by strategic autonomy. We should strengthen the European pillar of NATO. Europeans should deliver capabilities. They should strengthen the defense, but they should not create the false expectations that European states would be able to defend European allies if they are attacked by Russia, because the First World War, the Second World War, they indicated that it is impossible to solve the conflict with another major power without European involvement. And it's better that the United States is present militarily on the continent. And this is the strongest possible deterrence against Russia. But at the same time, we need to have a fair burden sharing. And that's right. And Europeans, if they use the word strategic autonomy just because it just helps to invest in capabilities, to develop them, okay, let it be. This is just okay, and we should accept it.
All right. Far from its western border, Moscow has another crisis to keep an eye on. We can show you images from earlier in the day. Russian nationals evacuated from Kazakhstan. This in the wake of 5 days of revolt that may or may not signal an internal power play within the elites of that Central Asian republic. Kazakhstan, where the situation now appears to have stabilized. It was at the heart of a virtual summit this Monday of former Soviet states that have sent reinforcements as requested by the regime there. And this was a chance for Vladimir Putin to repeat an oft-used mantra.
We are witnessing international terrorist aggression. Where did these groups of armed people come from, who have undergone training in foreign centers and clearly have experience of combat actions? We will not let anyone destabilize the situation here at home and implement so-called color revolution scenarios.
International terrorist aggression. Andrei Kortunov, is there this siege mentality in Moscow when there's a problem so very far away from Ukraine's border?
Of course, there is a siege mentality, and there is a perception that the West has, and not only the West, but also fundamentalists of the Islamic blend have some sinister intentions towards Russia and its partners. But I think that what we see right now in Central Asia is a sign that Russia might consolidate its alliances in this part of the world, especially after the United States decided to withdraw from Afghanistan and performed this withdrawal in a rather unorganized way. And the current developments in Kazakhstan create additional incentive for regional players to align themselves around Moscow. So what we see right now is a kind of consolidation of CSTO and this partnership of anti-Western Eurasian countries, including Russia, China, and countries of Central Asia.
The CSTO, which is that security alliance, of which there was a summit. Andrei, when it comes to Kazakhstan, when you see that, there's this, well, we had Belarus in August of 2020. Now there's Kazakhstan. At the outset of the show, we said how Vladimir Putin went into the talks in Geneva with a strong bargaining position if he's after amassing those 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. When you look at those other places where there's defiance of authority, defiance of the oligarchs, is Putin's hand weak or strong when it comes to the West?
Well, I think that if you take the immediate future, his hand is stronger right now than it was before. Because he can now say, look, you tried to fix Afghanistan and see what happened in this country. We tried to fix Kazakhstan, and let me assure you that we are going to be successful. So that implies that CSTO is an efficient alliance, and it has all the rights to be an equal partner to the NATO alliance in building security in the transatlantic and the Eurasian space. So now he has stronger bargaining positions, and I think he will not miss an opportunity to use these positions in negotiating with his Western counterparts.
Yeah, up until last week, Molly McHugh, many of us in the newsroom didn't even know what CSTO was. It's the first time they've ever deployed to any other country. This was at the request of Kazakhstan. Again, your thoughts on this, on whether Russia is strong or weak right now?
I think we should be cautious about what we understand on what is going on in Kazakhstan, given that both the Russian and the Kazakhstani governments have put out a variety of narratives themselves, and there's very little clarity about what's going on the ground. I think that what we do see is over the last year, it is as bad to be a friend of Moscow as it is to be an opponent, where you have both Belarus and Kazakhstan, which were sort of the independent strongman nations allied to Moscow, which have also been sort of forced back into the fold using Russian military deployments in a variety of ways, this requirement of needing Russian security for their own internal matters. And I think we really need to look more broadly at what Russia's ambitions are for itself in the region and see everything sort of on the same table and through a clear lens. I think the kabuki of the CSTO is the same as NATO. The Kremlin is having a lot of fun with its messaging on this. They are not comparative either in clout or in organization and what they stand for. But fine if they want to have their security alliance as well. But I think that the clarity of the situation here, which is it's no more fun to be a friend of Moscow than an enemy, is important in what we're looking at before us.
Again, Wojciech Lorenz, we're grappling with the question of whether or not Moscow's got a weak or a strong hand.
Well, I think that it weakens Russia's position, especially because it undermines Russia's propaganda, weakens Russia's propaganda, especially towards the West. Some 5-10 years ago, it was very effective. A lot of people believed that the tiny Georgia provoked Russia. Less than 5 million people and 20,000 soldiers provoked nuclear power to attack Then there is this consistent narrative that wherever people demand that their rights are observed, this is some kind of Western plot. And 5-10 years ago, still a large part of societies in NATO, EU countries were quite susceptible to this propaganda. But I think that today fewer and fewer people are ready to believe it. So this is mainly for internal public opinion. This is maybe for, directed towards Russia's friends, but it will not strengthen Russia's position vis-à-vis the West.
Andrei Kortunov, when you look at the tension, the uncertainty, there's one common thread throughout, and that is energy, natural gas. It was protests over a spike in energy prices that led to those unprecedented scenes in Kazakhstan. We were talking earlier in the conversation about leverage of the West or of Russia when it comes to natural gas prices, which have gone up and down ever since this pandemic. Is that the heart of the matter?
Well, I don't think that it's the only reason which led to all these protests and commotion and mutiny in Kazakhstan, but it was a trigger. It's important trigger, and indeed, energy is the blood of the economic of Kazakhstan, and it cannot be underestimated. We should also keep in mind that in Kazakhstan, a large part of the energy sector is controlled by foreign companies, including American and European corporations. And it's a kind of ironic that what Russia and CSTO are doing in Kazakhstan, they are protecting the property of US and European investors to this country. That's why I think that the US reaction to the Russian actions in Kazakhstan is so ambiguous and in a way self-contradictory.
Molly McHugh?
I mean, I think the U.S. reaction is muted because when we pulled out of Afghanistan, we lost all our leverage in Central Asia, and trying to figure out what we're doing there now is something we need to do. I think our Russian friend is right to point to this vacuum that is at play in Central Asia after the U.S. withdrawal from the region. I think what's happening in Kazakhstan is, by happenstance or planning, a good opportunity for Russia to remind that China may be the new money bag for the region, but Russia is still the strategic partner. And I think a lot of this sort of testing of roles, of influence, is what we see at play, and how that feeds off of what's happening in Ukraine, how the West is looking at these events. I mean, it will be considered quite seriously in terms of Russian capabilities, deployment, and ambitions. And I think that we see a lot of that on display in Kazakhstan.
One final question. I'll put it to you, Wojciech Lorenz. We're almost out of time. We've been talking about natural gas, and one of the leverages that Europe has, of course, is whether or not, this is all in Germany's hands, really, to open the faucet on the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline, which would bypass Ukraine. There's a new government in Berlin. Your thoughts? Is this going to happen soon?
No, I don't think that this is going to happen soon. And as long as Russia tries to blackmail the West and threaten the neighbors with military aggression, that this pipeline will not be operational.
I want to thank you, Wojciech Lorenz, for joining us from Warsaw, Molly McHugh in Washington, Andrei Kortunov in Moscow. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.